2024 general elections are round the corner. And look, you may vote for a political party for any number of reasons. It could be that you think that your religion or caste or cultural beliefs will be better protected if that party is in power. Or you may think that the party has a clean image, or that you have more faith in that party delivering its promises. Or it could just be that you like the face of its leader. Under a democracy, that's your privilege. Vote for whoever you like and for whatever reason. But the point remains that regardless of why you may have voted for that party, once it comes to power, it gets handed the car keys to the economy. And election manifestos are a great way to figure out where that car is going to be headed. Now, you could argue that most opinion polls are already awarding a massive victory to Prime Minister Modi's Bharatiya Janata Party. In fact, so much is the self-confidence in the BJP camp that there are reports that the Prime Minister has already asked his ministers to draw up a roadmap for the first 100 days of the new government. So why should you be paying attention to the Congress manifesto? Well, keeping aside the fact that no one really knows the future, manifestos also give an excellent opportunity to understand what the other side is thinking on the economy. What is the alternate economic vision for India that opposition parties are offering? Hello and welcome to The Bond Economist, your one-stop destination for professional advice on the economy. My name is Auradeep Nandi, and today we do a surgical analysis of the Congress manifesto for the 2024 Lok Sabha elections and what that could possibly mean for the economy. At the time of filming this video, the BJP was yet to release its manifesto, so a comparison between BJP and Congress is still not possible. By the way, as always, hit subscribe if you like this kind of content, and the super thanks button below is there if you would like to support me in this essentially one-man show. But look, before we begin, a few ground rules. First, paradoxical as it may seem, this is not intended to be a political video. This is not about supporting or denouncing any party. I am not a member of any party's IT cell or PR team. I mean, no one is sending me any checks. Two, this is a market economist view. So naturally, there's likely to be a capitalistic or market-oriented tilt to this analysis. So trigger warning for those out there with left or more socialist leanings. And three, I am not covering vague economic promises. What do I mean by vague promises? Well, when manifesto says things like we will focus on so and so, or support this, or encourage that, these statements are just feel-good words. They don't offer any concrete action plan, so I have weeded those out. So now that we have all the caveats in place, first things first, what are the economic promises that the Congress is making in its manifesto? Well, if you look at past Congress policies, a common theme that seems to emerge is this strong belief that the best way to make a problem go away is for the government to throw a lot of money and resources at it. Where it will get that money from is a boring detail that they aren't too concerned with. The UPA years between 2004 and 2014 were rife with expensive announcements like farm loan waivers, employment guarantee schemes, pay commission hikes, massive subsidy spending. The government essentially left the taps open with little concern on how that was screwing up the economy. And that theme seems to have also found its way in the 2024 election manifesto. 1 lakh rupees every year to every poor family going to the oldest woman in the household, 1 lakh rupees annually for college pass-outs to be employed as apprentices, a one-time waiver of education loans, an urban employment guarantee scheme on the same lines as the current MGNREGA for rural workers. Inspired by the farmer protests, the Congress is also talking of legal guarantee on minimum support prices. According to the Swaminathan formula, it is talking of raising the national minimum wage to 400 rupees per day, filling up 30 lakh central government vacancies, increasing the health budget, abolishing the angel tax, bringing down the cesses of central government, rolling back the centre's Agnipath scheme for armed forces that was designed to reduce the tenure of majority of the new recruits to 4 years, and in the process reduce the huge pension bill that the government is currently footing. And then, of course, there's that familiar drumbeat of promising to raise the 50% cap on reservations for SC, ST, and OBC, and also additional quotas for economically backward candidates and for women. Now, a lot of these measures are likely to give wet dreams to people who are on the left, who firmly believe in a bigger government. But noble as these promises sound, you, the taxpayer, will eventually have to pay for all of this. So, how much is this going to cost you? Now, the manifesto doesn't give a roadmap on how the Congress intends to raise the resources to fulfill these promises. So, I am having to essentially use publicly available data, make some assumptions, and then arrive at rough estimates. So, by no means are these precise. But let's do one thing. Let's take the baseline as the FY25 fiscal deficit target that Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman set in her interim budget, which is 5.1% of GDP. And let's then progressively add the estimated costs of all these key schemes that Congress is proposing. By the way, fiscal deficit is the difference between what the government spends versus the revenues it earns. So the difference is what the government has to essentially borrow from the market every year. Now, this is an immensely important metric. We have very high levels of national debt. It remains one of the main reasons cited by rating agencies on why India's sovereign rating is still just one notch above junk. And the government has managed to somehow bring this deficit down from over 9% of GDP during the pandemic to around 5% of GDP currently. And the aim is to get it below 4.5% of GDP by FY26. And look, this is remarkably difficult because it either means that the government has to find newer sources of income or it has to cut spending, which is also difficult because things like wages, subsidies, pensions are like fixed parts of our budget. If they are suddenly reduced, there would be a political backlash. So the fact that the current government has got fiscal deficit under control after they had to increase spending to deal with the pandemic is actually really impressive economic and political maneuvering. So for those of us who make a living on tracking Indian macroeconomics, even a 0.2 or a 0.3% of GDP increase in fiscal deficit in any year is met by a universal, oh, like, is there something wrong with the economy that the government has to reverse the progress it has made in controlling fiscal deficit? Now, all the schemes that Congress is promising will add to government expenditure. So, fiscal deficit, which is again expenditure minus revenues, will go up. Now, you can argue that, hey, growth will also pick up and with it tax revenues. So, maybe fiscal deficit may not go up by as much. In theory, maybe. But the fact remains that the expenditure outgo is going to be immediate. The moment you announce the policy, the money goes out of coffers. While tax revenues rising may happen in time, and there is a large element of hope involved. And it's also not a given that those revenues will be enough to balance the huge spending that you're doing on the one hand. And also, as we talk about later, very high levels of fiscal deficit can actually be detrimental to India's medium-term growth prospects. So let's look at the expenditure side. Let's whip out that calculator. Cash transfer of 1 lakh rupees to the oldest woman in every poor family. Question is, how do you define poor? What poverty line should you pick? One of the globally accepted standards for extreme poverty is an income of $2.15 per day. According to the World Poverty Clock, around 3.4 crore Indians fall under this level. That's around 2% of our population. Mind you, World Bank's numbers are actually much higher. Their 2021 estimates is in fact around 18 crore. But hey, for now, let's go with 3.4 crore Indians. Assuming that a family comprises of 4 members, that's 3.4 crore people divided by 4, or 86 lakh families that are in extreme poverty. Now, if you want to give the oldest woman in each of these families 1 lakh rupees every year, that comes to, well, 86,000 crore rupees. That's 0.26% of GDP. To put that in perspective, that is more than what the central government spends annually on urban development and close to what we spend on our health budget. By the way, if the Congress were to consider a higher poverty line of $3.65, then the number of poor would swell to 8% of our population, or close to 12 crore people. Do the same math. 12 crore people, 4 people per family. So 3 crore families, give 1 lakh rupees each to each of them, and you are talking of 3 lakh crore rupees. That's nearly 1% of our GDP, 0.9% to be precise. That would exceed one of the most expensive items that we currently have in our budget, food subsidies, on which we spend 0.6% of GDP annually. So let's add this to the fiscal deficit target of 5.1% of GDP. We have just calculated that women cash transfers add anywhere from 0.3 to 0.9% of GDP to it. So now fiscal deficit rises from 5.1% of GDP to anywhere between 5.4 to 6% of GDP. One policy down and we are already in an earthquake prone zone as far as macro fundamentals go. Next, 1 lakh rupees for every graduate below 25 under the apprenticeship program. So a recent government survey on higher education suggested that India has around 4 crore students in higher education courses. Let's assume that say 30% of them are in their final year. That's 1.2 crore students. Now let's be conservative and assume that only half of them apply for this scheme. So we are talking of 1.2 divided by 2, 60 lakh beneficiaries. Spend 1 lakh per year on each of them and you are essentially spending another 60,000 crore rupees or close to 0.2% of GDP. If all 1.2 crore of students line up and claim these benefits, then double that cost, close to 0.4% of GDP. So our original 5.1% of GDP fiscal deficit now balloons to anywhere between 5.5 to nearly 6.5% of GDP. Next, Congress talks of an urban employment guarantee scheme, a way to offer 100 days of guaranteed employment to people in urban areas. Now, the Aziz Premji University, in fact, had done some work on this back in 2019. I'll leave a link of their paper in the description. Their estimate was that this can cost anywhere between 1.7 to 2.7% of GDP. So cash transfer to women, apprenticeship program, an urban employment guarantee scheme, we are officially in the middle of a huge fiscal earthquake. FY25 fiscal deficit is at 7.2% of GDP, conservatively speaking, and over 9% of GDP if we consider the higher estimates. But wait, there's more. They also want to waive off student loans. Why a student who has taken a 20-30 lakh rupee loan to get an MBA or a foreign degree deserves a loan waiver? I'm not quite sure, but hey, the outstanding education loans in the system amounts to around 97,000 crore rupees according to the RBI. So that's another 0.3% of GDP walking out of government coffers. Now add to this Congress's promise to revamp the minimum support price system for farmers according to the Swaminathan Commission recommendations. Now, we have done an entire episode of this on the Bond Economist on the MSP issue. I'll leave the link in the description. In a nutshell, currently the government procures rice, wheat and some pulses at minimum support prices from the farmers. It stores it in its godowns, often quite inefficiently, and then mostly uses it to distribute free food among around 81 crore citizens. Now, MSP is currently set at least 50% higher than the cost of production for farmers. And that includes things like seeds, fertilizers, pesticides, fuel, etc. The Swaminathan formula that the manifesto is referring to and what farmers are actually protesting for says that in the cost calculation also include rent and interest foregone on the land and the machinery owned by the farmers. So as a farmer, if I didn't use this land for farming, how much rent would I have gotten on it? So that's my lost revenue. The government's own figures suggest that if the MSP is calculated like this, then MSP for rice could be 30% higher. For wheat, prices could be over 40% higher. So even if the new government were to stick to the crops that are currently being procured, but shifted to this new formula, the food subsidy bill would go up by at least 30% or so. So we currently spend around 2 lakh crore rupees on food subsidy. A 30% increase would be 60,000 crore rupees. And by the way, that would be a conservative estimate. If the new government were to purchase all 24 crops, which is one of the demands of farmers, and to their credit, the Congress manifesto hasn't committed on this explicitly, then the cost could potentially skyrocket. So have a look now. 5.1% of GDP fiscal deficit looks like a distant dream. We are now in the apocalyptic world of anywhere between 8% of GDP to 10% of GDP. That's a crazy amount. I mean, we are talking of record high levels of fiscal deficit, more than what governments have spent even during crisis years. But wait, there's more. The Congress also plans to cut down the central government's revenues. So the manifesto says that the Congress wants to reduce cesses to 5% of gross tax revenues. What does this even mean? Well, in theory, it's actually not a bad proposal. See, there are taxes, and with taxes, the central government has to share them with states. But the government also charges cesses and surcharges on the top of taxes, like health and education cess, agriculture, infrastructure and development cess, and these the central government is not required to share with states. So some argue that the central government is effectively cheating states by charging cesses. For instance, on income tax, we pay cess and surcharge. Instead, if the actual tax rate was increased by the same amount, then states would have gotten a share of your tax too. Now, that extra bit of cream goes exclusively to the central government. And this has become so convenient that the central government across years has kept adding cesses and surcharges. It's currently over 20% of gross tax revenues. Now, Congress wants to bring this down to 5%, which is of course going to be fairer for states. But it also means that the centre would then lose some 4 lakh crore rupees. That's 1.25% of GDP. So let's have a look at how much all of this is amounting to finally. Fiscal deficit could climb from 5.1% of GDP under the BJP rule for the next year to nearly 9.5% of GDP, conservatively speaking, and hold your breath, as much as 11% of GDP. If the estimates are on the higher side, these are absolutely crazy numbers. So what would the impact of this be on the economy? Look, at one level, there is no denying that consumption growth, which is currently subdued, will pick up because of this. If you give people money in their hands, they will spend, and growth in the near term will pick up. And if wages are increased and you run huge employment guarantee programs by the government, then poverty could also reduce. I mean, after all, we are still running MGNREGA scheme, that is a rural employment guarantee program. And whenever there's rural distress, people do flock to this scheme for employment. But the government spending its way to growth is not a great idea, because growth driven by very high government spending has a lot of side effects. When fiscal deficits are out of control, demand shoots up in the economy, things get more expensive, inflation surges, which by the way hits the poor the most. The RBI would then be forced to raise interest rates to control that inflation. That in turn will make borrowing very expensive for the private sector, who will then be investing lesser. The government too would struggle to spend on infrastructure like roads, railways, ports, power stations, because it is already spending so much money on tolls. That, by the way, once you introduce them, it's going to be really politically difficult to roll them back. And this investment deficit will start to impact India's medium-term growth prospects. Meanwhile, fiscal deficit is essentially what the government has to borrow from the market. So such high levels of fiscal deficit means that our already elevated national debt, which is above 80% of GDP, will skyrocket to record highs. That means a very high chance of India being downgraded by global rating agencies to junk status. And that means that borrowing costs abroad for Indian companies will soar. Meanwhile, such high levels of consumption will inevitably lead to us importing more, and current account deficit will shoot up. India will again find itself in the familiar twin deficit problem, that is, both fiscal and current account deficits are running unsustainably out of control. Foreign investors would get more and more nervous about India. They would exit the country, start dumping the rupee, the currency would probably start depreciating, and then the RBI will have to lose its record high forex reserves currently by trying to sell dollars and control the rupee depreciation. Macro stability could go for a toss. I mean, it just seems to me that the Congress has gone into full Santa Claus mode in terms of poll promises. Now, at the time of filming this video, the BJP manifesto is still not out. So we don't know if the BJP will also do a similar ho 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 and race the Congress down to the populist bottom. Or would their promises be more macro sensible? For more such insights, like, share and subscribe to The Bond Economist.